Hello and a very warm welcome to this working session on resilient infrastructure and how to actually make infrastructure resilient at the European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction 2021. My name is Olaf Bruns. I'm a journalist based in Brussels, from where I moderate this, with an eye on EU affairs, social policies and sustainability, and it is my pleasure to guide you through this debate. Now, perhaps a few words on the background. On the one hand, there is certainly an increasing demand for new and innovative infrastructures and services. But on the other hand, there's also dangerously aging assets in many places in Europe and Central Asia. Taken together, these two facts point towards the need for more resilient and more sustainable strategies in the planning phases as well as in the realization of all infrastructure projects. Critical infrastructure needs to be made more resilient. Now, let me just walk you through a few figures. According to the Sendai Framework Monitor, in 2018 alone, almost 1,900 infrastructure assets in 20 countries in Europe and Central Asia have been damaged or destroyed as a result of disasters. Taken together, these amount to direct economic losses of over $3 billion, that are 2.6 billion euros. But that's dwarfed again by a study of the EU Joint Research Centre that calculates that the current damage to infrastructure in Europe due to disasters and climate change is around 9.3 billion euros a year. And if you think that sounds a lot, it is indeed nothing compared to what's expected in the future, where we might see this sum double until the middle of the century and almost increase fourfold to 37 billion euros by 2080. Now that is still annually. Well, that makes almost 40 billion euros in damage to infrastructure every year expected in 2080. So to put it in layman's terms, we'd better get our act together. But to do so, to get our act together, we're facing a number of challenges. For example, currently, there is no common understanding of what resilient infrastructure precisely is. Simply recovering or adapting to changing conditions and transforming for building for the future. Another challenge is the need for common principles, for metrics, indicators, to serve as a common ground for DRR measures and policies. And we still lack information in many areas. There is a lack of disaster loss data, particularly on indirect losses. There is a lack of understanding on how cascading risks impact the very interconnected infrastructure systems. There is a lack of risk disclosure for major infrastructure projects. And finally, more clarity is needed on the role that governance, the private sector, and incentives can play for integrating resilience and monitoring. And on top of all that, we are in a particular historical moment where the COVID-19 pandemic has shown what happens when there is not enough investment in resilience. But now, with recovery plans and therefore investment going into building new infrastructure, and given that the bulk of funding for the COVID-19 recovery will be used to support public investment and key structural reforms, it is really the critical moment to take considerations of risk reduction and resilience on board when we discuss how and where these resources will be spent. So that's what we're here to discuss, exploring ways forward, but also finding practical solutions for addressing these challenges. And to discuss this, we should have had a very distinguished keynote speaker and 4 equally high-level panelists. Now, as I hear the keynote speaker has not joined us yet. We hope that he still comes in for the keynote speech, and we will try to improvise and arrange the debate and to make room later for his speech. But we also have, and I am delighted to introduce Dr. Dilanthi Amaratunga, who is a professor of disaster risk management at the University of Huddersfield in the United Kingdom. We have Françoise Jacob, a very warm welcome to the UN resident coordinator in Serbia, et je vous souhaite la bienvenue en français. And I'm very delighted to introduce Peter Lauer, the head of division of risk management and critical infrastructure protection in Germany. Auch Ihnen ein ganz herzliches Willkommen. Try to do that in German too. And we have Liz Varga, the chair of complex systems, civil, environmental and geomantic engineering department at the University College of London. So let's get the ball rolling and let's have a look at governance and policy mechanisms. So the first question maybe to Professor Liz Varga, what do we understand by resilient infrastructure and what should be basic metrics and principles of how resilience looks like?
Okay, so Olaf, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. You pose such a huge question. I think we could be here for days to discuss this, but so I will try to keep it in like a small amount of time to get the conversation going. So of course, what we want from resilient infrastructure is for infrastructure that it is under threat of disruption to be able to absorb, to be able to resist, to be able to recover, to adapt and transform if needed, but also to learn about how to better resist and adapt in future. So we need all these capabilities in our infrastructure systems in order to be resilient. Now, we are working with the UN DRR to set out some principles for resilient infrastructure. Now, these are very much underpinned by goals. So what goals do we want to achieve from resilient infrastructure? And if I just step through, there are only 6. So if I can quickly just give you a flavor of these, and then perhaps we can develop the conversation. So we see that infrastructure, in order to be resilient, must have a goal to be collaborative. Infrastructure is a system of systems. We have specialists in each system, whether it's energy provision or water treatment or sewage removal. We have specialists, but we need to share knowledge across infrastructure for the whole system to be resilient. The second principle is to be protected by design. And the goal here is to make sure that whenever we make an intervention into infrastructure, whether it's a maintenance or the building of new infrastructure, that it is prepared for hazards, not just ones we know about now, but also the future. And these include more severe and intense and frequent climate disruptions. The third one is to be able to adaptively transform regardless of whether we have chronic or acute disruptions. And if you think of something that is a chronic disruption, it's very much about population growth. We know our infrastructure cannot provide the critical services as it stands today for the growing population. The infrastructure services would have to double or triple even in the next few decades. The fourth one is to continuously learn, and this is to know our infrastructure better so that we are prepared for the growing intensity and severity of hazards. We also need to be integrated with the environment, and this means working much better between grey, green and blue infrastructures. And then the last one is to be socially engaged, and this is very much about understanding our customers have also got a very big role to play for reducing their consumption or deferring their consumption in order not to put our systems under pressure or to make them vulnerable to attack. I think if that's enough, I will stop there for now because I don't want to hog the whole meeting. I can obviously expand So please let me know how I can follow up.
Yes, thank you very much, Liz. I am struck by how much we're just starting to have a debate on infrastructure, and the amount of points. I'm not going to take up all the 6 points now because I must admit I didn't learn them by heart in the short time. But the amount of times you mentioned stuff that was not hardware infrastructure, which very much points, I think, to the fact that, well, you said it has to be collaborative. It's about the people concerned, after all. We have to learn to know it better, and there is the environmental aspect. It's just striking to what degree it is not only about hardware here, but it's about the people, and it's about the context, of course. So I would like, before we delve perhaps deeper into 6 points, to throw the same question at Dilanti Maratunga. What is your take on how do we what really do we understand by resilient infrastructure, and what could be metrics and principles of resilience?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, of course, the speaker before set the scene really well, in my view. But thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to shed a little bit more light into the same discussion. In my view, the critical infrastructure are the primary physical structures, technical facilities, and also systems which are socially, economically, and operationally essential to the functioning of a society or a community, both in root circumstances and in the extreme circumstances of an emergency. I think that point is really important to emphasize, in routine circumstances and also in extreme circumstances of an emergency. That is quite an important point I want to emphasize. And also, in my view, the infrastructure systems are the critical lifeline of social and economic activity in any society, which connecting communities, industries, and markets, and also in providing the essential services that underline daily life. Estimates show that infrastructure investment needs in developing countries in particular could range from 2% to 8% of GDP per year by 2030. These investments will be crucial, in my view, to meet the global demand for reliable electricity, transportation, telecommunication, and water services. So getting back to the defining of resilience infrastructure. In my view, the resilient infrastructure is the ability to withstand, adapt to changing circumstances, and recover positively from shocks and stressors. Resilient infrastructure will therefore, in my view, be able to continue to provide essential services due to its ability to withstand, adapt, and recover positively from whatever shocks and stressors it may face now and also in the future. So in that sense, I want to introduce 6 disaster resilience properties. Of course, they are very much complementary to the speaker before me, but with added components and different components. So they are adaptive capacity, participative capacity, coping capacity, rapidity, robustness, and redundancy. So very quickly, I will actually take you through what they are. If you sort of actually take the adaptive capacity actually means a property of a system in which structures are modified to prevent future disasters. And you have seen that in coastal areas of most of the countries, particularly after the Indian Ocean tsunami. A lot of structures were actually adapted to face any future tsunamis, for example. And the second point that I want to emphasize is the coping capacity. The meaning is that the capacity to identify problems, establish priorities, and mobilize resources when conditions exist that threaten to disrupt some element, system, or any other unit of analysis. So I think generally the people are very much, a lot of communities are very capable of sort of this coping capacities, but that needs to be dealt with as a continuous basis. So the third property that I want to highlight here is the participative capacity. The meaning is that a system's ability to change its own structures to interventions by other systems. Again, we have actually sort of seen that characteristics relating to sort of coastal hazards in particular. And the next characteristic that I want to highlight is actually the redundancy. The redundancy is actually the extent to which elements, systems, or other units of analysis exist that are substitutable and capable of satisfying functional requirements in an event of disruption, degradation, or loss of functionality. Again, quite an important point in providing resilience to critical infrastructures, in my view. And the fourth one is the rapidity, meaning the capacity to meet priorities and achieve goals in a timely manner in order to minimize losses and avoid future disruptions. Again, one of the very important characteristics of a critical infrastructure system. The last one, but not the least, is actually, I identify that as being very robust. The meaning, the ability to maintain desired characteristics of the system despite changes to its entire characteristics. So these are actually the 6 areas that I want to highlight in adding and complementing to what the previous speaker was discussing. Then I suppose I will actually stop at that so that the conversation can actually take it from there. Thank you very much.
Dilanti, thank you very much. Now we have two sets of 6 basic principles. And before moving on, I just take this back to Liz, perhaps. Twice 6 basic ideas. Which one of Dilanti's points are, because where I would like to go to is integrating all the ideas of the people around the table here, well, around the virtual table. So which are the most important ideas taken from Dilanti, Liz, which you would integrate into your set of principles?
So it was a pleasure to listen to Dilanti, actually. I think that if we had a head-to-head, I think we would be very much overlapping in our thinking. In fact, all the capabilities that she has mentioned, I think we have already absorbed into our 6 principles with our goals. It's just that, I suppose, from the perspective we were taking, the capabilities are, if you like, can be realized under the different goals. So for example, by being environmentally integrated, you need all these capabilities to be considered. So it's like almost like the capabilities give you the how to make resilience happen. So you need robustness capability. So how do you do that? Well, you do that via the 6 principles that I set out, but then you can find measures for them. So I think we're very much on the same page. I couldn't tell you which one was more important because they are all critical.
Of course they are. Thank you very much, Liz. I take that same question. What do we understand by resilient infrastructure to the perhaps the specific context of Serbia with Françoise Jacob?
Great, thank you, Olaf. It's really great to listen to the previous speakers. Look, I think for us, in a way, I work with the biggest integrator, which is the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goal. And there's been some recent studies with UNOPS and UNEP that the infrastructure taken in its role as a backbone of the economy of the society actually can impact 92% of the SDG indicators. So in terms of an integration role, that's what it is. And then let me also, since we just finished COP26, let me just quote also 2 numbers from the same studies that was issued by these 2 UN agencies. One is that infrastructure actually generates, the broader infrastructure generates about 79% of the greenhouse gas emissions and represents 88% of the cost in terms of adaptation. So just these three numbers, give you an indication of the impact of infrastructure and the complexity of this field. And what is interesting, and I speak from really the field experience, is that we never put infrastructure at the center. Infrastructure is always considered as, at best, a mean to achieve something, but it's always considered on the side. And it's something that, the bad guy, or not the bad guys, but the big guys and the masons take care of. Well, actually, infrastructure is about the well-being of society. And now, more and more, at the core is the well-being of the planet. So this is how at the UN we look at this. And I was glad to hear Liz mentioning that she works with DRR. DRR has produced this really wonderful piece of knowledge last year on the role of critical infrastructure and how we can disaster-proof critical infrastructure. And if you allow me, I'd like to say, around the table, and the audience here, I'm sure, is convinced of the role of infrastructure. And we know there's going to be massive needs, or there are massive needs for new infrastructure and to renew the old infrastructure. And we know there is financing available. So I want to maybe pause a moment to talk about the other aspects that I see. And again, this is very much of a field perspective. For me, infrastructure is about governance. So it's about how do we want to engage, how do we want to facilitate the engagement between a government, local government, the cities, and the citizens, so that we start to develop this really good, resilient infrastructure system. And the reality is, where I see gaps is not so much in the technical knowledge around the infrastructure, which is represented very well around this panel, but more around the knowledge, the capabilities, the understanding that is available or not at the level of implementation of all these very good policies. So in Serbia, there's actually a number of policies that have been developed, both in terms of disaster risk management. Serbia was one of the first countries to sign on the Sendai framework in 2015. There is also a growing body of policies and laws on, new climate action laws, energy transition law, renewable energy. So the foundations are here, really, or they are being put in place. But really, where we get stuck is in moving the policy forward, moving the knowledge forward on the ground at the pace that is required to get to 2030 and then 2050 in the best way possible to reach the net zero ambitions and to make our world safer to live in. So I have lots of things to say on that, but I will stop also here for the other speakers to jump in.
Thank you very much, Françoise. And well, you mentioned it, the enormous greenhouse gas emissions from infrastructure, but I think very rightly you put this whole debate into the context we're in, which is we have to fight against climate change, because otherwise we're not going anywhere. And you said it is very much about governance, and that also means policy, of course, and that also means institution building. And this, of course, fits perfectly in this first part, which is actually of the debate, which is about governance. So maybe a question to Peter: what regulatory and policy changes would bring the most dividends to communities? Because we're speaking about people here, really, and which policy changes would ensure the resilience of infrastructure, according to you, Peter?
Yes, thanks, Olaf. And if it's okay with you, I would like to line out 3 points or 3 messages in terms of regulatory and policy changes. My first point is that we believe that we need a holistic package of legislation for all sectors of critical infrastructure on different administrative levels. And this package of legislation could be defining what is critical infrastructure, could be defining criteria for identifying critical infrastructure, and maybe even prioritizing. And this package could also be defining requirements on an all-hazard approach for critical infrastructure, for risk analysis that is being done within critical infrastructure, for risk mitigation measures, for crisis management elements such as reporting schemes for incidents and damage. Because talking about incident and damage, we see that a comprehensive overview, situation overview, is lacking very often when it comes to disasters. So strengthening reporting schemes or making them mandatory in one way would enable us to get an overview much faster and much better. The Critical Entities Resilience Directive that is currently being discussed within the EU is, from our point of view, one example of legislation in the making that is offering exactly this holistic package for critical infrastructure, or for all sectors of critical infrastructure. Actually, the operators used to be very reluctant when it came to discussing legislation or regulation, and we see that this is changing. And this is changing actually a lot because looking at the increase of cyber attacks or natural hazards or health hazards, I guess we all see there is a need for improving or at least retrofitting our risk and crisis management in terms of critical infrastructure. My second message is it is also necessary to intensify public-private cooperation. And I know this may sound old or boring. We've been talking about this for the longest time, but we've seen with the flood disaster in summer that not just rebuilding critical infrastructure, but also building up emergency supply, like, for example, emergency water supply, emergency power supply, or emergency communication, is only possible with the help, or actually with the initiative of critical infrastructure, of utility companies, and hence critical infrastructure. Only they have the stockpiles of technical equipment, and much more important, they have the expertise, specific expertise for rebuilding, for emergency supply. And this help needs to be coordinated. And this summer in Germany, the associations took over this job, coordinating this help being offered by companies, by utility companies. And they've done this job pretty well, but it was an ad hoc solution. And we believe that we need to make it somehow a more permanent solution. So, for example, by implementing standards on cooperation, we could make it more permanent and more lasting. And my third message is that we strongly believe we need resilience strategies on national and on subnational level. And the UN Sendai framework process initiates exactly that. And this is a very good thing because these strategies carry the idea of strengthening resilience into all relevant departments and sectors. And may it be civil protection, critical infrastructure protection, city planning, financing, healthcare, just to mention a few topics. In all these topics, strengthening resilience should play a major role. And resilience strategy can be the common denominator or the common foundation for all those that carry responsibility in these topics. And including so many topics and stakeholders into strengthening resilience, we also believe that we need some kind of coordination or a coordinator, an authorized representative for resilience matters. She or he could be the hub or the center point of initiatives in different departments and different sectors. And with this, I'm giving back to you, Olaf.
Peter, thank you so much. And I said it already when answering to Liz. Am I muted? No, I don't have a... Can you just give me a sign if you can hear me? Yes, perfect. Okay, I already said when I was answering Liz, that I am I actually expected to moderate a debate on hardware, on stuff, on concrete on the ground. And Peter again highlighted how important it is. Well, we're speaking about people, we're speaking about institutions, we're speaking about structures. And I would like to give the same question further, to hand this also to Françoise. Your ideas of regulatory or policy changes that would bring the most dividends to communities, and that's perhaps the B side of that questions, that would also ensure the resilience of infrastructures. Françoise.
Yeah, great. Well, first, I think you know, the planning phase of any infrastructure, particularly critical infrastructure, is very important. And I should say, right now, Serbia is in the final stage of doing their national spatial plan. Very important document. And I think one of the links that we are missing is extensive and effective coordination with communities. And I know sometimes, you know, when you live in big cities, we don't fully understand what this means and how this can happen, but it's really important. And today there is a greater awareness among communities and among citizens of what they want from their small town, from the city. There is a greater knowledge on the fact that an urban area needs to be, you know, more people friendly. There is now discussion about nature-based solution. There is also the greater awareness of the new sort of disaster, and one of the main one here in Serbia and in the region is air pollution. So people they want to be involved, and it's really interesting when you talk to mayors in Serbia or when you talk to the ombudsman, to hear that a greater number of interaction and on complaints are actually about the environment that people live in. So not just the trees, but really literally the environment, the infrastructure environment that they live in, complaining about lack of sewage, complaining about the waste management system, the fumes coming from here and there. So I think there is an understanding also from the people that among the bouquet of rights that we also have rights related to our environment. And we need to interact. And the institutions do not necessarily know how to interact well with people on this consultation and on the planning. The second element, which for me is key, because I'm working here in the Western Balkans, but I've worked also a lot in Asia, is the regulations. So number one, we need to improve the building regulations by all means, and both to make it more resilient, but also to really address the topics of climate change. So that's the core body of regulation, and this core body needs to really be disseminated and translated into actions, and that can be really shared and understood by everyone, by the last businesses on the link of building the infrastructure. That's the first thing. The second thing is there is still a number, and we are looking at, again, outside the core, the hardware infrastructure, but you still have a number of subsidies that exist in the economy that go against building resilient infrastructure. So you still have a number of subsidies that promote fossil fuel or sort of fossil energies, infrastructure that generate a lot of emission, etc. So we need to remove these subsidies so that there can be more space for green investment, resilient infrastructure. And the third part of this aspect is the monitoring and enforcing bodies. Typically, and I see this even within the UN, we focus a lot on the regulation and we don't put enough attention and support on the enforcement bodies. And these are keys. So these are really important institutions to upgrade, to upscale, to extend, and we need to make sure that they become accountable. And one way to do that is to also make the citizens more aware of the role of these monitoring bodies, so that they can put pressure on these monitoring bodies for them to perform their role, so that, you know, we don't build a waste management set up a system right by the river without a number of extremely important additions to the infrastructure. So this is how I see things a little bit.
Francois, thank you so much. Thank you very much. If I remember right, the figures of the last IPPC report that was released before the COP26 meeting, according to the figures, and don't get me exactly on the figures, but it was over 90% of the current investment in infrastructure still increases greenhouse gas emissions. So that might back up what you just said, what you were just saying. But perhaps zooming in a bit further on COVID-19 recovery, because that's the moment we're in. Well, we're about to start, and investment in resilient infrastructure. I would like to ask, and I'm perhaps asking Dilanti first, what are some of the incentives or good practices for engaging the private sector to invest in resilient infrastructure? Because probably public bodies will not be able to do that all on their own. So how to get the private sector in? Dilanti. Dilanti, are you still there? Dilanti seems to be disconnected for a moment. We hope that she comes back, and I ask the same question to Peter then in the meantime. The incentives and good practices for engaging the private sector to invest in resilient infrastructure. Peter. Peter, you seem to be muted. It's like the sentence of the area now.
Oh, okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Olaf. Yes, investment is very important, and critical infrastructure operators and their associations, they often ask us, at what point is there enough investment in strengthening resilience? And that's actually a very good question, because it shows there is a need for defining states or governments' expectation and hence resilience goals. So my first point is we do need resilience goals to accompany incentives or investments. Just a few years ago, for example, we published a guideline on emergency power supply containing recommendations for very specific resilience goals. For example, being able as a critical infrastructure to maintain emergency power for 72 hours without refueling. And before publishing this guideline, we weren't really sure how recommendations like these would be received. And the feedback was in general very positive, because critical infrastructure told us we need to have something that we can use as some kind of as some kind of goal, to be able to see how further should we go for when it comes to investments into resilience. So the feedback was very positive, and meanwhile, resilience goals like these have made it into the rules and standards of the associations in Germany, specifically of the association that is providing technical regulation for power supply, as an example. So resilience goals, very important. My second point is legal security. To be able to invest, companies and critical infrastructure operators need to have some kind of legal security. We see that adequate legislation and regulation make it much easier for those companies to invest in and implement resilience measures, because even if companies or the technical staff, the technical personnel see the need for investment to strengthen resilience, it is much easier to receive internal funding if there is some kind of obligation. So that obligation can be created by legislation, it can be created by regulations such as norms or standards that supplement legal principles. My third point is guidelines and manuals. Legislation and regulation cannot show in detail how to implement risk and crisis management, and cannot show in detail what needs to be done in terms of investment into strengthening resilience. So guidelines and manuals can support specifically SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises that might not have a lot of resources for risk and crisis management and for investment into resilience. So on the one hand side, guidelines and manuals could help with the implementation process, and on the other hand side, they could be the starting point for public-private cooperation that we feel is very important and for developing standards and norms. And my last point is initial funding or funding in general. This can be a very strong incentive. In 2020 and 2021, for example, we received funding from an economic stimulus package that was set up to cope with COVID-19 and with coming up crisis situations. And based on a specific situation we have, we were able to provide funding to water supply companies and to finance or to partially finance resilience measures. And these resilience measures included, for example, emergency power generators or vehicles for water transport or interconnecting pipelines between different water supply companies. And although the water utilities had to carry the majority or the major part of the investment, our initial funding was just a very small part. This initial funding that we were able to distribute triggered nearly 700 measures all over Germany, additional measures in this sector, in this water supply sector. So sometimes it only takes a small incentive to trigger major changes, but investment, or at least partial investment, is very important.
Peter, thank you very much. I think there is a buzzword for what you just said, which is you need to have the millions for the billions. So you go the first line, and then you're able to attract much more investment in that. But Peter, I wanted to just a quick follow up, and I'm asking a naive question, perhaps. I thought like the problem in, or that's how I read it until now, the problem in investing in DRR is basically that it's very difficult to build a business case for it, because the best you can expect is reducing costs in the future. But you just mentioned, and there's no return on investment immediately. You can't make profit. There's no cash stream coming from DRR investment. But you just mentioned these resilience goals, which seem an interesting idea to me. Is that something that can work around this dilemma, that you basically can't really expect a massive return on investment?
Yes, we believe at least at least in certain situations, because what we see is that critical infrastructure operators and also the associations, they do see that the situation is changing, that we have to face, or that we are facing a situation where we have more hazards and threats that might be triggering damage or outage in critical infrastructure. So there is a certain eagerness to do something and to invest, but then if companies want to invest, they also need to have a certain information on the limit. What needs to be done? What's the expectation? A certain benchmark to not just go or to not just let the costs go through the roof. So there is a certain idea. Yes, we need to do something. We need to do something in addition to what we've done already, but we also want to have a certain threshold or a certain benchmark to know, okay, that's enough, and that copes with the expectation from the government side.
Peter, thank you very much, and I hope I can bring Dilanti in now. Is Dilanti back? Well, I hope it's just, if I may, the infrastructure failing us here, the technological infrastructure, but Dilanti seems not to be there. And Liz, may I bring you into this debate on how to engage the private sector? Ideas from your side?
Yes, definitely. So, I mean, I've really enjoyed listening to the other speakers, and these are really great ideas that need to be brought together. So we have, I think, as Peter put it, some holistic framework to take this actionable interventions forward. So there's, we have also in our work identified this need to create, we've called it tolerance. So specifically tolerance to irresilience. Now this means how much will a nation accept a lack of resilience? So should a nation, or will a nation say, well, 95% of our critical services must always be operating 24/7 every day of the year? Or is it lower than that? Now, with that measure comes some, if you like, it comes with a risk, because it means that we will stop investment when we reach that goal. But actually, it should, in some ways, ought not to be a goal. It should just be a minimum threshold. So we should always attempt to do better. The challenge with setting the goal is that often the people who will, if you like, fail to receive critical services will be the ones that can least afford them, usually the least poor, the most vulnerable. And this is really where we must protect, because critical services, even if it is just about, you know, mobile communications, which are now seen as critical. So it's not just about potable water, not just about power supply, it's about everything that is deemed critical. So we need to make sure that if we do set this tolerance level, that we don't marginalize the people in the population that could be least able to have a voice to actually improve their situations. And therefore we just have to take care that make sure that whatever policies we set up or incentives, that it will include and make sure that those are not excluded. I think in terms of also policy, I think things like resilience literacy, I think is beginning to be understood, so that the population is becoming much more aware of the language of resilience. And this idea of adopting resilience at multiple levels is becoming much more popular. And we see even household level resilience coming into play, where people are already thinking, well, we will have emergency situations, especially people that have been in flood situations. So they will already be, if you like, they have an awareness, which is like the first step towards becoming more resilient, and also their understanding of behaviours. So if, for example, the more information we can give them, if you like, on overconsumption, so if their household is not performing as well as others, we could nudge them towards the average, which should be ever decreasing. So can we reduce consumption, therefore put less pressure on our infrastructure networks, and therefore we will be more resilient. So there are loads of opportunities at different scales. And if I may, Olaf, just one more point. I know, you know, it's difficult because being a professor, I can talk forever. But just one more point is on this. So we have established a concept called net resilience gain. Now, this is similar, if you like, to the concept of net biodiversity gain, net environmental gain, which colleagues should probably be familiar with. Now, the idea of net resilience gain is that we have an understanding of how resilient we are at the scale that we measure. And if we can, whenever we make an intervention into infrastructure, we always evaluate to what extent we are changing the resilience status of that, if you like, socioeconomic or geopolitical group. And so if we always have the ambition to increase net resilience, then we will already be, if you like, on the pathway. And it could be through the various mechanisms that Francois and Peter and Dilanthi described. But this idea to keep in mind that we want to increase resilience, which ought to be a target until we reach this tolerable level. I hope that's enough for now. Thank you.
Liz, no worries at all, of course. We're inviting professors because we want their knowledge, of course, that implies speaking a lot. And also, there were two professors invited, and Dilanti is disconnected for some reasons. So you have to speak for two actually to represent the academic side. So this is really welcome. But Liz, still, I would like to take you up on 2 points you just mentioned, which I think are very closely together, just to perhaps elaborate a little further on the concept, because it's a new concept. Not everybody is aware of resilience literacy. And you mentioned, well, nudging people towards consuming less to put less strain on the systems. How to do that and where to go? So that's a triple question almost. It's resilience literacy, but you're professors, you like that.
We do, absolutely. Okay, so let me take the literacy first then. So this idea that we, if you like, socialize the language of resilience with people. So do people understand what we mean by redundancy? You know, and are, if you like, households or communities or villages, you know, whichever scale you like, do they understand what having some redundancy means to them? So bringing the language of resilience into that. So to what extent do they think they can absorb different types of hazards? You know, if there is a flood, if the local generator is disrupted for some reason, do they know how to absorb this? Have they got the capacity? Do they know who's operating in that? So are they using the words that we're using for resilience? And even if we have to change the actual words, certainly the concepts that underpin these, are they well enough understood for them to know that it's an important thing for action, that needs action to be taken? So it's about socializing the language of resilience at all levels. And I think this is not just a residential household problem. I think it's also a commerce and industry problem. Obviously, businesses are really keen that they do not have interruptions. We see this very evidently in things like hospitals. Okay, so hospitals know, because they have diesel generators, they know they need to care for people in their intensive care, people who need the heating on, that they cannot survive, that they would actually have deaths within a few hours if they didn't have power or heating. So hospitals understand this idea of resilience, or to some extent, but how do we get that into different scales and into different levels and into businesses? We could be doing that. We've had things like shifting your demand. So we already have, it was called, not triage. There was a scheme in the UK where industry could be asked to stop using energy and defer their energy use for later in the day when we thought that the grid was at its capacity. Now, they would be paid to defer their industrial use of energy, so they would have like an income stream for it. And obviously, they would have some pain because maybe staff would have to work in unsociable hours or catching up on overtime. But there was, if you like, a recognition that this could be done and actually could achieve better resilience for the whole system. So again, like I say, literacy is at all scales and has different potential for interventions. Nudge then, so this idea that when we talk about changing behaviours, you know, no one will change a behaviour, if you like, if you tell them to change their behaviour. You know, we have our own past experiences. We know how we do things. We don't like to change out of that. But what we can do is speak to the emotion of people, to nudge them in the right direction. So this idea that we explain to them that, you know, a really good example that we've just been teaching on this morning is about the avoidance of water for things like hotels when they have like lots of washing and cleaning activities. So how can we avoid water usage? So what you do is nudge the consumers of the hotel resources, like you know, if you have a towel in your bedroom, if you could avoid putting the towel to be washed every day, then we reduce the water consumption. You nudge them in that direction, not by saying it's good for the environment, you must do this, because people think, oh yes, it is good for the environment, but this is not how I behave. So they still put it into the wash. What you do is you talk to their emotions. You say to them that 95% of the people that have been in this hotel room have kept their towels and used them for 2 nights. You want to be part of that social group. You're engaging with people who come to the same place, use the same hotel as you. You have to be part of that social group, and it's emotional engagement. Therefore, they don't put it into the wash. So you have to be very clever and do some intelligent marketing almost, if you like. They were the 2 points. I think, your third question, Olaf, was to how to make these happen.
Was implicit already in the
in my answer. Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm still looking for Dilanti, who I love to bring in back, but I think she is definitely disconnected. We're losing speakers in this session. The keynote speaker couldn't show up, and now Dilanti is gone. It seems there. Well, whatever is going on, there's this hope that in the last few minutes that we still have that somebody of them either is coming back. That would be great, of course. Perhaps moving this.
Olaf, sorry, Peter has his hand up.
Yes, please. I didn't see that.
Olaf, thanks a lot. I would just like to pick up one point from Liz that is from our point of view is key, or is very important, and this is language or literacy. When we talk to critical infrastructure operators, we just sometimes we just don't understand each other, and when we talk to people, to the population, it's the same. We just don't understand each other. Not always, but sometimes it's very problematic, because we seem to use a language that is very difficult. This resilience terminology and language might be something that is used by us, but maybe not by people that want to be resilient as well, but don't know what it means. Or it's not being used by operators, by companies. So language is key, and it seems to be so easy to reach a common understanding, but it's not. And it's very often just language. It's of course it's also other obstacles, but language is often the one of the major obstacles, and we just need to be able, or we need to see how we can adapt, or how can we change that language so that others, our partners, understand that, and we just don't. We wouldn't be able to reach resilience if we wouldn't work together with companies. We wouldn't be able to reach resilience if we wouldn't try to reach out to the population. But we also need to make sure that they understand us.
Peter, thank you so much. I'm as I said, I'm increasingly impressed by this debate, how much it steered away from the hardware in the beginning already towards the people, and now we're at language and emotions. But that's what it all comes down when you're dealing with human stuff, of course. I would like to put this question of incentives and good practices for bringing in the private sector into the very specific context, probably of the Balkans or Serbia, and ask the same question to Françoise.
Thanks. I was really sort of refraining myself from engaging in the previous conversation, because one of the biggest challenges that we have within the United Nations is to bring the understanding of our Agenda 2030 all the way to the villagers, and we constantly have this discussion. But what we have really identified is the need to work a lot more with the media now. And I think in the context of COVID recovery, vaccination, any sort of complex climate change, we now need to reach out to mainstream media and also to the education system. And I will come back to that. I think when it comes to the engagement with the private sector, the UN is not often perceived as engaging, but we actually do, and we do at the global level through what is called the Global Compact. And at the local level, I spend a lot of time actually talking to either private sector directly or through the chambers of commerce. And I see several things there. First, there is a few sort of trailblazers, and these are the big, 10 big companies in Serbia. They can be infrastructure, they can be manufacturers of whatever drugs, and these companies, they have a vision, which is sometimes driven by an individual, or sometimes it's driven by the finances, the shareholders back in another country. So this is important. They are the trailblazers, and they set some examples that show that resilient infrastructure, climate-proof infrastructure, or energy transition is feasible. And so what we are telling these guys is, first, advertise what you are doing a lot more. And second, make sure that your value chain, your supply chain is completely embarking on the same sort of train that you have taken. That's the first thing. The second thing which I noticed is the myriad of small and medium-sized enterprises, which are the fabric of society in Serbia and elsewhere. These guys are lost. And so you have a tiny minority of people who really, go into innovations, and they have the education, and so they start different things. And the UN, by the way, support that. We support pilots, we support innovation in air pollution management or different type of innovation. But that's really, really small. The majority of the small and medium-sized enterprise are asking us, what do we have to do? Tell me 5 things that I need to do to be more resilient. And COVID brought that discussion. And this is something that, by the way, UNDRR is doing, the UNDP as well. So what can I do? 5 things. So it's as simple as looking at, your electricity consumption, your energy efficiency. So the small things like this. And then the other thing is, we are really trying to present the whole resilience agenda and climate change agenda around infrastructure as an opportunity. So we really want to move away from the threat discussion. And I keep saying this to the private sector, which is, if you just look at the heating, the energy transition, and the new heating sort of systems, and heating in countries like Serbia is critical infrastructure, and a lot of the heating is actually through public heating systems. There are huge opportunities for medium-sized companies to get involved into, energy efficiency, insulation, change of windows, change of doors. Sorry, I'm very practical, but this is the reality on the ground. And then this is a region where you're going to need a massive change from carbon-based industry to non-carbon-based industry. And it's a region, if you look at the Balkan 6, where you can have, actually there is enough size that you can have economy of scale, and that medium-sized businesses can really take off on the transition agenda. But they need the knowledge, they need the incentives, the financial incentives, and that is being put in place. And they need the regulation. So I think and the skills. So my sort of last point on that is how we engage in the discussion on infrastructure with the education sector. And I guess this is, you're a high level professor. I'm assuming you teach in university, but when I look at our economic development and infrastructure development, a lot of the planning, the decisions are made by non-engineers, right? And what I see in the education system, secondary, vocational training, and tertiary, I see that the agenda around the resilience, the issue of resilience and climate change, this is still a marginal agenda. So it might be at the core of your work, Liz, but on all the other things, you take an MBA, there's been some research recently that shows that the green agenda, the transformation agenda, the resilience agenda is still a collateral element of this. And so we have to look at how we also expand the knowledge of the future decision makers, of the young entrepreneurs. How do we expand their knowledge so that they understand what's at stake when we talk about resilience, sustainability? And I'll stop here.
Francois, thank you so much. And Liz, Francois was talking to you directly, and you were nodding, so I just give you the floor to react straight away.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I mean, we are actually in UCL, we are all ready for our engineering students. We're planning courses on resilience and risk reduction. We already have some in hand. We're introducing new ones. Indeed, I'm introducing a master's program on infrastructure systems that is very strong component on it. Resilience obviously is one of the primary outcomes we want of our future infrastructure systems. So absolutely, we need to improve the education and skills so that when these graduates come into the workplace, into public office, that they are speaking this language and will be empathetic to the need for this in our investments. If I may, Olaf, if I just touch on the investment subject as well. So I suppose since probably globally the 1970s, we've had an increasing movement. In fact, it was quite radical in the 70s and 80s towards public-private partnerships, where a lot of the state-owned critical infrastructure then became privatized. Now, this was obviously all well and good, and it meant that there was now appetite from the private sector to make investments into infrastructure. And often these would be things like, retirement funds that were looking in the long term, because obviously the infrastructure is there for the long term. So this was all well and good for this particular situation. But when we get to the situation we can now foresee to the 2030s and beyond, where we have these much more severe challenges with climate, indeed with things like COVID and other forms of threats, whether it's cybersecurity or other threats, we now may see a potential swinging back towards more state ownership, just because the state can understand maybe better the investment needed for resilience, because actually the state will pay if the private sector if you like, fails at resilience. We sometimes say some businesses are too big to fail. So therefore, the governments will have to bail them out anyway. So if it becomes the state responsibility, then they might already, they probably would understand better to make these investments into resilience. But there are lots of evidences in the literature that actually there is an economic case now for investing in resilience, whereas maybe 10 years ago, we struggled to find evidence where things like strengthening for seismic hazards has avoided disruptions to infrastructure because it's made the structure much stronger and avoided it. Things like where we have bridge collapse because of the materials that are used. When we rebuild, we can rebuild using composite materials, which are much more likely to withstand the weather implications. So they're less likely to corrode or less likely to have fractures, just because the materials used and the design mechanisms that are adopted. So already we are thinking about how to adapt infrastructure, but it's making this much more, it's telling more about these stories to engage with the population worldwide so that locally they can understand what their challenges might be and where the investment ought to be prioritized.
Liz, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I want to just funnel this a little bit further down into the COVID-19 recovery, and would perhaps ask Peter, how can considerations of risk reduction and resilience, and when I say risk reduction, I mean natural and human-induced risks, how can considerations of risk reduction and resilience shape how COVID-19 recovery sources will be invested? Peter, some thoughts about that?
Yes, thanks, Olaf. I mentioned before that we strongly believe that we need resilience strategies on different administrative levels, and that these strategies would support that this idea of strengthening resilience is being carried in all sectors and in all departments, and also into the private side, into by, for example, critical infrastructures. So asking how can considerations of risk reduction and resilience shape the recovery is actually connected to this idea of bringing the idea of strengthening resilience into any topic, every topic, into every department, into every company, into every critical infrastructure, because it's going to be very important to think resilience whenever we deal with financing, whenever we deal with critical infrastructure, whenever we deal with spatial planning, whenever we deal with city planning. So it's something that should be on the agenda in all those topics, and hence also it would be on the agenda when we think about how can considerations of risk reduction shape how any recovery investments or resources are being invested. So it should always be on the agenda. It should be with all departments. It should be with all private enterprises on the agenda. And this we can reach. This is what we believe, if we bring this resilience, strengthening resilience, this idea into all those topics by, for example, implementing resilience strategies. So resilience should be something that is on the agenda, that is being thought all the time, due to the fact that we see that we face more hazards, more threats, and that we need to become more resilient.
Peter, thank you so much. And we're almost at the end of the time allocated for this debate. So I would like to still stay on this very, very, very quickly, very shortly on this topic, how to, well, basically put considerations of risk reduction and resilience into the COVID-19 recovery spending. And maybe a minute each, Françoise and Liz, in that order. Françoise first and Liz first, but please, just a minute. Françoise?
Great. Okay. Well, I think there is a temptation everywhere to rebuild fast and to continue to build and to do business as usual. So my repeated message is that we need to fight against system apathy and system complacency. It's just too easy to do the same thing as before. And for that, we need, a very strong commitment from government. And to get the strong commitment, we need the pressure from the citizens. So I think we also look at the civil society as representative, partial representative of the society, as a strong enabler of building forward better. But I think we also need to bring the values of quality, the value of a good future, the value of a holistic lifestyle, the value of social issues, equalities, and environment well-being. I think we need to constantly massage this narrative in our narratives that tend to be, as we said before, very complex and very jargonic. So we need to go back to what these changes mean for the life of people, back to the emotions.
Thank you very much. Thanks particularly for sticking to the time limit, and Liz, the same point for you.
Yeah, thank you indeed. So I'm going to stick with the people angle, because I think people are part of our society. We want our societies to flourish, and critical services will enable that. So what I will tell you about in 1 minute is about a people environment laboratory that we have in UCL in the east side of London. There we are doing science on the interactions between people and infrastructure. And we are examining indeed how these infections such as COVID viruses are spreading. So what is it about our interface with infrastructure, with the use of railway carriages, the use of handrails? How can we know how we are transmitting diseases? Is it airborne? We need the science and we need the evidence to give us these, and this Pearl laboratory and in future a cave laboratory that sits adjacent to it is being built. Please get in touch. I can tell you lots more.
Liz, thank you very much. And I would really like, we're just running a few seconds already over time, so I would really like to thank all speakers for their thoughts, their participation in this debate on how to make infrastructure resilient. And I think we managed to gather a lot of food for thought. Notably, I noticed a very, very clear aspect of well, implying people. It's about the people, it's about communication, it's about language, it's about emotions. That is something that came up again and again, but it was also, of course, of steering money towards the investments needed. And there it was very clearly, there were clearly the aspects of, well, leave no one behind, building back better, and sorry if I stick to the slogans now, and having the millions for the billions. So I think that there is a few promising ideas around. So really, again, a heartfelt thank to all the speakers. I very much regretted that Dilanti was disconnected for some reasons and that the keynote speaker couldn't make it. But thanks to everybody who has followed us, and really thank you very much, and keep up the good work. Thank you.